Happy Canada Day! Hi, hello, welcome in. I'm Jerica, a writer, editor, and all-around content creator. This month, I'm focusing on Canadian artists, both in books and video games. And if you want to know more about the latter, you'll have to check the description for my Twitch and gaming YouTube links. As far as books go, I do have a TBR for this month, as well as some recommendations if you want to join me in exploring Canadian authors. I'd love to know what your favorite Canadian media is, and you don't have to stick to books and video games. You can expand out to TV, film, music, board games, whatever you like. Drop those down in the comments for me. First, let's talk about my recommendations. The first one is Split Tooth by Tanya Tagaq. So this one I was actually recommended kind of in my first semester of professional writing oh my gosh, what was that course called? Is exploring Canadian literature and kind of like the environment in which Canadian literature has been created over time and what that environment looks like right now. But we looked at a couple excerpts of this, and what I found really interesting, there were a couple things that I found really interesting about this novel. The first one being that it's technically mixed media. It is mostly prose, but it does have some poetry in it. There's a couple illustrations throughout, as well as the introduction of at least one passage in Inuktitut. So that was really interesting. The other really interesting thing to me is that it's something called autofiction, which, I mean, it's kind of like a memoir or a biography, like an autobiography, except it's not, because while this is based on her like teenage diaries, like she found her diaries and then she decided to write a book that kind of like followed along that story, but it's not true. Like, enough has been changed that this isn't like her story. It's just it's inspired by her life, I guess, but more closely than other things might be inspired by one's life. So anyways, I thought that was really interesting. It's also very clear to me when you're reading through it that she was a songwriter first. Even her prose is very like melodic and poetic. Yeah, I think that's what I have to say. Ignore all of my tags. I've gone through, I went through a little bit of a period where I was annotating like crazy, and I tried it for a couple of books, and I didn't like the way that I was doing it. I'd like to go back to it and try a less complicated way of doing it that I think I'll actually like get more value out of. I think I'll do a video on that. It's, I think if I had to add like a third thing to it that I really like, and I will do a more in-depth video, is the magical realism in it. So she also, like, while she draws on her own diaries and lived experience, she also draws on like the folklore, the tales, the myths that she knows from growing up and hearing her elders talk about that, and kind of like weaving that into her experiences, which I think is really cool. Yeah, that's Split Tooth by Tanya Tagaq. Good book, you should read it. Warning that it is very emotionally raw. It like does not pull back from kind of like the trauma that she experienced living in Nunavut in the 90s. So if you're not ready for that, if you're not, I'll leave some content warnings in the description. That way people who want to see the content descriptions can. But we'll move on. Where do I put you? I guess I'll just put you to the bottom of the stack. My next recommendation is Moon of the Crustesd Snow by Waubgeshig Rice. Hopefully I said his name correctly. I found a video like during that course that taught how to say Tanya Tagaq. I didn't think to look one up for him, and I feel bad about it. But this I think this was the book that I read after this one. I had seen review of it by one of my favorite booktubers. I actually started watching her for bullet journaling, and now she has gone pretty much full booktube, Plant-Based Bride. She's super cool. You should go check her out. Although if you're here, you probably know about her already. But that was part of the reason why I wanted to read this. The thing that kind of like made me read it like at the time that I read it was that I knew that there was a sequel coming out, and yet I have not picked up the sequel. I will pick up the sequel. I will read it because I think the world of this book is really good. Again, like I said with Split Tooth, I'll also do a more in-depth video about this one. But this one is more in the like genre that I would usually lean to, although I do really enjoy literary fiction. This one is kind of like dystopian sci-fi, perhaps post-apocalypse. It's kind of unclear, like we don't get a huge, like this is very localized, which makes sense, because they're like living in a pretty isolated, I'm pretty sure they're living on a res, but they're definitely living on a res, very isolated one in northern Ontario. So like they're already isolated, and then basically like all communication and electricity is cut off. This happens very early in the book. This is not a spoiler. This is kind of like the catalyst of why the story gets told. But it does mean that because they've lost all communication and they don't travel out, we don't really know what happened. Maybe we find out in later books. I do wonder if we're gonna get 4 books in the series. That's like my guess. It could also be 12 books in the series or 13 books in the series, but it does feel like it's kind of like seasonal rather than like the monthly moon cycle. But they are all like moon of the whatever. So I think something that I really liked about this book is how authentic the dialogue feels. Like I can hear like the res speak in it, if that makes sense. Oh, another thing that I did really enjoy about this book is the like dream sequences. I don't want to talk about it too much because it will get like a little spoilery. But I'll just say those are really well executed in for a couple of different reasons. I think that's all I have to say for now about Moon of the Crusted Snow. Again, definitely worth a read. There is at least a sequel out now. I feel like there will be more, but I'm not actually sure, so don't quote me on that. My third and final recommendation for this video is Confessions of an Igloo Dweller by James Houston. Weirdly, also Indigenous related, also Northern related, but written by a white man. However, he does have his own Inuktitut name. I'm unsure how to say it. I'm gonna say Saumik. Not sure. It might be Saumik. Might have more or less vowel on there. But it means left-handed, and I think that's just like kind of interesting that actually shows up on the cover as well, because it's talked about in the book. This is non-fiction though, rather than fiction like our last two, although I suppose Split Tooth is kind of like somewhere in the middle. I'd say definitely closer to fiction than it is non-fiction. It's pretty well planted in fiction. But because it draws on her actual life. Anyways, this one's nonfiction. It's a memoir, and it's kind of, so the way that I feel like I have to go, I want to go into like a little like thing of like the difference between memoirs and biographies real quick. I'll leave timestamps and things perhaps. Maybe I'll leave up a banner or something of me doing an education in the middle of this video. Basically, the main difference between biographies and memoirs is that biographies tend to be more technical and also cover a full life, or like a life up until the moment that they're written, if they're written before the person's deceased. Whereas memoirs, while they are about someone's life, they usually choose like a topic or a theme that they follow. And I really only bring this up to say that like the topic or the theme of this is technically art. However, because of the time and place and way that James Houston was living at the time, there's a lot of like his life in it. But what I find extra interesting and what I really like about this is while James Houston is an artist himself, this isn't about his art. This is very much about Inuit art. And that's really cool to me because of the time that it's taking place, which is kind of like late 50s, early 60s. His main goal throughout the time that he covers in the book is getting Inuit art to be seen by people further south, both like in southern Canada and into the United States as well. So that's kind of like the through line of everything, but the anecdotes show like a lot more than that. Art is part of culture, so it would be really hard to not explore like the rest of Inuit culture, as well as the fact that like he's not just like going up and like spending a day in the Arctic. Like the first time that he goes up to the Arctic, he was already very excited to go up, and then he falls in love with living in the Arctic, and he spends like most of the decade-ish that we spend with him in the book in the Arctic. There are times where he flies back down to Ottawa, or he has to make a business trip to the States, or like the prairies. Like he does spend like little spurts of time, but rather than spurts of time in the Arctic, he's spending spurts of time elsewhere. So it's kind of hard to like tell the story of like going around and finding the artists without also exploring what living in the Arctic is like, and then also like being a white man living in the Arctic, living among the Inuit, and how they receive him and how they receive other white people who show up. There's a lot of really interesting anecdotes that give a lot of insight into living in the Arctic at the time. I will say that because it's about his life and art, there are definitely some pieces that would be told differently if it were somebody else telling the story. I'm unsure, but I'm pretty sure that the 60s scoop would have been happening. I mean, it started before the 60s anyways, but I do think that it impacted. We do get like a little look into like tuberculosis and other like virus outbreaks and things like that. But it's not a particularly political book is what I'm trying to get at. Yeah, again, I'll do another video looking a little deeper into this with my thoughts a little more cohesive, although I feel like I was most cohesive talking about this book. It is the one that is most fresh in my mind. I did read the other two at the beginning of 2024, whereas this one I finished in May, I think. I might have finished it early June. But that's Confessions of an Igloo Dweller. If you are looking more for a nonfiction book and you like memoirs, this is a great one. I know not everybody enjoys a nonfiction, and this isn't the usual type of nonfiction that I would read either. I'm usually more of like a reference and self-help, I suppose. I don't read a lot of nonfiction, but like right now, like the nonfiction that I'm really looking for is kind of reference books, like talking like people who have written about writing and written about editing. But previously I've also read like the bullet journal book. It's called something different than that. But moving on from my recommendations to my TBR, I'm not a super prolific reader like some of the other people here on BookTube, so my TBR is quite small, with 2 novels and a short stories collection. I may try to hit the bookshop and pick up one more novel, because I think I could read 3, which is why I do have a short stories collection to kind of pad this out, because I'm not really sure. It'll be kind of like, depending on how much of July is left, whether I pick up another novel or read this. But the first novel is The Troop by Nick Cutter. For these, I'm going to read the description and then do like a little chatting about, I guess, why I picked it. So The Troop says, once a year, Scoutmaster Tim Riggs leads a troop of boys into the Canadian wilderness for a weekend camping trip. A tradition as comforting and reliable as a good ghost story around a roaring bonfire. But when an unexpected intruder stumbles upon their campsite, shockingly thin, disturbingly pale, and voraciously hungry, Tim and the boys are exposed to something far more frightening than any tale of terror. The human carrier of a bioengineered nightmare. A horror that spreads faster than fear. a harrowing struggle of survival with no escape from the elements, the infected, or one another. So, it's so weird. I didn't realize the, like, very top of this until, like, a few days ago. It has the hashtag horror book talk sensation, so I didn't even realize that this was apparently a really, like, popular book on Book Talk. That is purely by accident. Not that, like, I'm against that, it's just weird that I didn't notice, but I happened to pick this up anyways. So when I went into the bookstore, Split Tooth, Moon and the Crusted Snow, and The Troop, I all picked up on the same one. I went in wanting Split Tooth, happened to see Moon and the Crusted Snow at, like, the front and knew that I had wanted to read that. But the other thing that I had gone in for was I was looking for a horror book. I went over to the horror section and I'm like, why are all of these Stephen King? Which is what happens every time I go to the horror section, which I'm not against reading Stephen King by any means. I have read some of his stuff. I have a short stories collection that I'd like to read. I'd like to read, like, some of the like classic Stephen Kings, because I really like the movies that have been made out of his books. I'm a big, like, horror person, and I know that the books tend to be very different from the movies, so I'm curious to see kind of the differences there. But I was like, I'd like someone different, please, and there's very few, but this one called out to me. And then also, like, it happened to be Canadian, which is always a thing that will make me want the book more, just like it'll make me want the video more, or I meant the video game more. If it's Canada, and this has always been a thing. I'm, like, oddly nationalistic when it comes to, like, supporting artists, I suppose. I also like to support artists from not Canada and not America. Not that I'm against that either, but I don't know, there's stuff out there that I think we don't get to see very much. I've rambled, I've tangented, but yeah, Canadian wilderness, horror, and yeah, I don't know, I don't think there was really anything else that drew me in, except that, like, this is an interesting question, and I saw it asked recently about, like, what, like, makes you pick up a book and read it, like, what makes you choose to read a book. And of course, like, the options were, like, the cover, the title, and the description, because, you know, lots of people, like, put a lot of emphasis on the cover, and I think a lot of people do choose by the cover, but the first thing that always makes me pick something up is the title. And then, like, I'll look at the cover, and the cover, like, may intrigue me more. But what actually makes me read a book is the description, which is why I hate how we've stopped putting the descriptions on the back. This book is great for it. It has a description on the back, but so often it's, like, hidden somewhere. I guess on, like, paperback, it's not as bad. They've definitely, like, kept to doing that for the most part. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I have to go back to, I have to go to a real bookstore, or not a real bookstore, like a bookstore and not a secondhand bookstore, because otherwise I'm just basing it off of, like, books from I don't know when they were published. Anyways. Horror. Canadian wilderness. And, like, maybe something zombie-ish, which I'm also super into zombies. Like, I would say my favorite, like, subgenre of horror spec fic is, like, dystopia, and particularly I really like zombies. I don't know. I know a lot of people have, like, gotten burnt out on zombies, and I totally understand that. It's just something that, like, I've always enjoyed. Speaking of zombies, real quick, gonna throw a plug in here for Feed, because it's zombies but different. I will do a video on that. It's probably my favorite book right now, because I have a really hard time picking favorites. So basically whatever, like, the most recent, most, like, phenomenal thing that I've read is, like, my favorite book at the time. So I think before this, I would have said my favorite book was Split Tooth. Although Shame Shine Blind is pretty close. Okay. let's move on to my next TBR book, which is Nostalgia by M.G. Vassanji. I will read the back for you. It says, an indeterminate future on... Oh my gosh, I can't read. In an indeterminate future, in the prosperous countries of our world, people can live long lives in constantly rejuvenated bodies. Human immortality seems at last within reach, and age has ceased to be a factor. A renewed body requires a new identity. Therefore, a person's past history is erased from the mind and a fiction of choice implanted instead. On occasion, though, cracks emerge and reminders of previous lives seep through into the conscious mind, threatening destruction. Dr. Frank Sina specializes in sealing such memory leaks. A brilliant and respected scientist, he lives a more or less contented private life with his young lover. One day, a strange-looking patient called Presley Smith arrives in his office, bothered by a persistent thought that is evidently a leaked memory. Thus begins an intriguing relationship. Who is Presley Smith? What abandoned world does he come from? And why do the thoughts of this one patient so obsess Frank Sina? In his attempts to help this tortured patient, irreparable cracks in Frank's own fiction begin to emerge. So this is another kind of like topic of book or narrative that I really like, is exploring like memories and like repressed memories, and I don't know, how fickle memories can be and how you can remember things wrong so easily. I think part of that comes from my own poor memory. And also part of it comes from having been really interested in psychology. That was the first thing that I went to school for. I do not have a BA in psychology. I did not finish my psychology degree. But I did do, I spent enough time learning enough about psychology, and like obviously I went into it because I was interested in psychology. I think the mind of a human is a very interesting thing. I think human behavior is a very interesting thing. Which means I'm actually also really interested in sociology and anthropology, and I understand the difference between all of those things, and I like where they kind of like intersect and stuff like that. Anyways, so that was definitely one thing that drew me to this. Also, part of the reason, like the reason that I was even able to find this book is the bookstore that I went to. It's a local, mostly secondhand bookstore. It was my first time there, even though I've been wanting to go for forever. We went to, like, I think it was because we went to our buddy's concert, and the bookstore is like right next to it. And I was like, what? I didn't know there was a bookstore here. Although it's a very popular secondhand bookstore in Ottawa. Black Squirrel Books, and Espresso Bar. But they have like a whole section for Canadian literature, and I happened upon it, and I was like, oh, I'll look at some stuff in here. So again, I went about, and again, I mean, it's always the spines that are facing out, so I don't know how people are picking things off the cover anyways. I guess when you go to like a quote-unquote regular bookstore, they do have some that like are facing front, and those probably get picked up more. But it's the title that called to me, Nostalgia, which is really interesting because I know I said I wouldn't talk a lot about video games here, but there seems to have been a lot of nostalgic video games come out recently. I've done a couple of, like, I've covered a couple of showcases, and there's been a lot of nostalgia games, so it's just funny that, like, the title Nostalgia also grabbed me here. I am very curious to understand why there's a lion on the cover of this. Yeah, I don't know. But basically, the memory thing is what drew me into picking this one. Again, like, speculative fiction is probably my favorite, whether it's like sci-fi or horror or literary fiction that's also speculative fiction. I think that's one that people kind of forget about when it's speculative fiction, because I feel like some books like are just spec fic, even though technically that's an umbrella term. I guess fantasy can also fall in speculative fiction, but I think there's speculative fiction that is literary fiction as well, that doesn't fall, that like technically could be put into probably science fiction. That's probably where it would land. But I think sometimes it's like just speculative fiction. I don't know. Or maybe we need to split our genres up a little further, because I feel like Like, I like science fiction, but but when I say I like science fiction, and people are like, oh, there's this great alien book, and I'm like, not really the science fiction that I like. I'm not against aliens, but they're also not my favorite. Like, space is not my favorite subgenre of science fiction. I like low science fiction, I guess. Soft science fiction, also. The final book that we're going to talk about is Wilderness Tips by Margaret Atwood. This is a short stories collection, so it's not one that I necessarily have to read all the way through. It'll be to kind of pad out my reading to make sure that I'm still reading Canadian books, because I don't think I have another Canadian novel that I haven't read on my shelves, so I do have to hit a bookstore if I want a third one. But I've read one story out of this. Let me read you the description. In each of these tales, Margaret Atwood deftly illuminates the single instant that shapes a whole life. In a few brief pages, we watch as characters progress from the vulnerabilities of adolescence through the passions of youth into the precarious complexities of middle age. Atwood paints interior landscapes shaped by time, regret, and life's lost chances, endowing even the banal with a sense of mystery. Richly layered and disturbing, poignant at times, and scathingly witty at others, the stories of Wilderness Tips take us into the strange and secret places of the heart and inform the familiar world in which we live with truths that cut to the bone. So I've read one story out of this. It was called Hairball. It's the second story. I have no idea why I read the second story. I probably will try actually not to read these in order, just for the fun of just picking the one that's calling to me that time. Although I feel like I should read the title one. The short story is within it, in case you've read short stories that were published elsewhere. We have True Trash, Hairball, Isis and Darkness, The Bogman, Death by Landscape, Uncles, The Age of Lead, Wait, Wilderness Tips, and Hack Wednesday. So I read Hairball. It was a wild ride of a short story, so I'm kind of hoping for just as much weirdness in the rest of them. Yeah, I don't know, it was it was really weird, but I mean, I love weird, because while I have nothing against formulaic writing either, or formulaic creation, when people get the chance to show something that was really weird, that they experimented with, that's always great. And I think art should be weird. We should be allowed to get weird with art. I actually had a conversation about short stories recently, and they were talking about how because they're a comedy person, they were short stories are kind of sketch comedy, whereas novels are a special or a sitcom or something like that. And I was that didn't quite land with me right away, but we talked about it a little bit more, and it did end up making sense. And it's basically you can attempt weird stuff with short stories, and not quote unquote waste as much time as you would with a weird novel. So you can try stuff and see what lands and what doesn't. And then in theory, you could then take those short stories and expand them, because the ones that hit, that everybody really likes, even though they were weird, they were an experiment, they were a leap of faith. You can take those and expand them because there obviously was an audience, if it makes sense, because that's the other thing is you definitely tell different stories when you're telling a short story versus a novel. I also, part of me wants to not get a third novel and just read short stories, because I feel this is twofold actually. I feel I don't hear people talking about reading or writing short stories nearly as much as I do people reading novels and nonfiction, and writing novels. And I prefer to write short stories, at least right now. That's where I'm at in my writing right now. I much prefer writing short stories, and I think it actually harkens back to that idea that you can experiment and try something weird, and it's not a time sink the way that a novel is. Though I absolutely think that you should just write the weird novel. I also just this is kind of me with all art. Not that I do like a lot of art, but like I also prefer like really small canvases and like playing around on really small canvases. Like if I have a big sheet of like watercolor paper, like I cut it up or I like mark off like individual like little things and I work in just that small space. And I do wonder a little bit if this is like related to my particular flavor of neurodivergence, and it's about wanting to like be able to finish it and knowing that I can finish something short or small or whatever. Anyways, I think that I hope that the rest of the short stories in this are going to be super weird. And either way, this also harkens back to, I've said harkens back twice. This also goes back to like the idea of me being really interested in like human behavior, because this is all about like that like catalytic moment. Catalytic? This is where the editor comes in. The moment that is a catalyst for like a big change. Like these people are like having like a huge change, never going back to the way life was before. And I can absolutely assure you, in Hairball, nobody's going back to the way things were before. Yeah. Okay. So that's my TBR and my recommendations. Just a reminder, recommendations were Split Tooth by Tanya Tagaq, Moon of the Crusted Snow by Waubgeshig Rice, and Confessions of an Igloo Dweller by James Houston, and then my current TBR, which you'll get to hear about as I read through them, is The Troop by Nick Cutter, Nostalgia by MG Vassanji, and Wilderness Tips by Margaret Atwood. Whether you're reading Canadian books this month or not, tell me what you have planned for the month of July or what you're currently reading. And if I do make it to the bookshop, I'll try to do like a mini vlog. I don't know if it'll be like a shorts mini vlog or like a short video mini vlog, but we'll see what happens if I make it there. Keep your eyes peeled for those videos that are going to be deeper dives into the books that I've talked about in this video. Thanks for watching. I hope you guys had fun. I had a blast. Catch you next time. Bye!